Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Fermentis's Expo Showcase Q&A and chat. We're stoked to have you here with us. I've got some wonderful gentlemen here with me from Fermentis, Jose Pizarro, Kevin Lane, and Brian Kreider, to answer anything and everything you could ever want to know about what Fermentis has to offer here. They're going to just take it away here. So they're going to answer. They're going to moderate the chat as well as some of our Fermentis folks in the chats, and then also pose your questions in that Ask a Question box. If you see a question that you would love to make sure it gets answered within our very short 20 minutes here, please make sure to rate that. And that way it'll pop up to the top and they can make sure to get that in. But not to worry, if any questions go unanswered at the end of this, it's no big deal. They'll go in and post those answers at the very end of this, and it'll be with that live recording that gets generated pretty much immediately after the session. So without further ado, I'll let you gentlemen take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. So I can see a lot of questions arriving in the Q&A box. I'm going to take the first one. So Larry is asking us, please explain why there's no need to oxygenate wort when using dry yeast. So I would say that it's not using every dry yeast. At least at Fermentis, we say that, and we have demonstrated with a couple of studies. So that's related to the way we grow our yeast, and we grow the yeast in fully aerobic conditions. So we make sure during the production process that the yeast gets saturated in sterols and unsaturated fatty acids. So when you're putting oxygen into your wort, or if you are aerating the wort, actually what you are doing is provide oxygen to the yeast to produce those compounds, so sterols and unsaturated fatty acids, that the yeast will use during the growing phase in fermentation to produce more cells. But as a long story short, as I was saying, through the production process, we saturate the yeast in those components, so there is no need to oxygenate the wort. Like the yeast that we deliver to you guys has enough sterols and unsaturated fatty acids to bud quite a few times. So the second part of the question will be like, okay, but what if I oxygenate the wort? It's going to be used no matter what by the yeast, but there is no need. It's not mandatory. Kevin, do you want to take the one about Kveik, quiet yeast?
I'd love to. Thanks to Carrie for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for showing up and asking your questions. We're here today to try to answer everything that we can in the limited amount of time that we have. The question is from Roxanne. Will you be coming out with Kveik strains? It's a great question. I think the best way to answer that is to kind of go along the lines that I went along the lines of during the Craft Brewers Conference when I gave my presentation. And the answer to that question is not perfectly clear. Within Fermentis, we're obviously always watching the market, seeing the trends in the market, looking at our own portfolio and seeing, if there's a gap somewhere in our portfolio, and then obviously responding to that and either trying to fill it or trying to find out how we can fill that gap with our own strains. In terms of Kveik yeast in general, I know that we're starting to look into it. I'm part of the technical team. I know that we've had discussions around it, and that we're working with people that are very familiar with those types of yeast. In terms of when we would come out with the Kveik strain, I'm not sure. I know that we're researching it right now, trying to find the best option, trying to find the right option for our portfolio to really complete it in that manner. So we're looking into it. I imagine that at some point we will come out with one. I'm just not sure really timeline-wise or which strain that we will eventually be releasing.
Thank you, Kevin. And actually, Roxanne, we met her at HomebrewCon a couple of years ago. I've been in Cincinnati giving a homebrew club lecture for them. Really nice to see you here on this Q&A live. I see also Doug Piper. Hi, Doug. Brian, I see a couple of questions that we get pretty often that are good, actually. Can you answer the question, do I really have to rehydrate my active dry yeast? And also the question,
Right.
is it true that if yeast is not rehydrated as much as 50% of the yeast cell may die?
Right. Yeah, I saw there were several kind of related questions there. So we recently conducted a study on our yeast strains to look at this very thing, to determine what is the best way to rehydrate, what is the best media to rehydrate in, and also because we know a lot of brewers are direct pitching the dry yeast directly in their wort. We also looked into that practice as well. And then what we found is that with rehydrating in any type of water, mineral water, tap water, or distilled water, there was really no change in the viability of the yeast post rehydration. And then also rehydrating in wort, 7, 15, and 20 Plato, I believe. There was no difference in viability rehydrating in those different types of worts either. And then also direct pitching saw no difference in performance between rehydrated or direct pitch into the fermenter. The fermentation kinetics and flavor profile of the beers were the same. So the short answer is no, a separate rehydration step is not necessary. And yes, as far as, if yeast is not rehydrated, as much as 50% might die, we would see a difference in the fermentation performance when direct pitching if that was the case. So maybe that was early on when dry yeast was new to the market and, quality wasn't the same as it is today. Maybe that was more accurate back then, but now we've come a long way since the, mid 90s when dry yeast was kind of new to the brewing market. So the yeast that we're putting out in the market are much more robust and, following rehydration, common to have, higher than 90% viability.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys have anything to add, by all means.
I will add on what you were saying, Brian, that actually since we first released active dry yeast for brewing purposes in the market in 1994, there have been huge advances in the drying process. So nowadays we are able to dry the yeast without affecting its quality, actually, without killing it. We just remove the water and the yeast is still alive. So that's why today, actually, you have such high viability in the dry yeast we sell, and a lot higher than what it was in 1994. So I would just wanted to add that. Kevin, I think there is a question. Maybe you can take. Let me check it. Yes, so it's a question from Scott, and I think maybe he attended the lecture I did a couple of days ago. So he says, I understand from some of your research that since lager yeast may have such minimal metabolism at very low temperature, that possibly it plays no role in lagering. Comments? So I'm not sure I said that in the lecture, but maybe if you can expand a little bit on the question.
Sure. So I think I understand what the question is. In terms of the metabolism of yeast, obviously, I mean, it kind of follows suit with most things that the warmer the temperature you are, the more activity you have, the more metabolism you have. So if you are to drop to low temperatures, such as in a lagering stage, you will have very slow metabolism, if any. Obviously, it depends on what temperature you're reaching and if there's even anything fermentable left in the beer. The second part to that, so it really, the metabolism of the yeast isn't going to do too much at that point, just given the fact that most of the fermentable carbohydrates are gone. Most of the materials that the yeast would use from the wort, or at that point from the beer, will have already been consumed and and converted to something else for the yeast to grow and to be healthy. But the reason for lagering in terms of cold storage for an extended period of time is, number one, is traditional. That was something that was put into practice a long time ago. But number two, I think that most of the time you're looking for some lysis, some release from the yeast cell itself, from the yeast being in the media, in an alcoholic media, and degrading slightly and releasing some compounds over time. And what, from my experience as a lager producer a long time ago, you do get more of a roundness in terms of the beer, in terms of the mouthfeel, in terms of the flavor, which is because of that longer aging period in the cold temperature. So it's not that the yeast are converting things so much in that cold temperature, but more so that they're slowly releasing some compounds that are giving more fullness, more roundness to the beer.
Thank you, Kevin. Brian, I saw a couple of questions in the chat that maybe you can answer. So it's going to be two questions. The first one is, what happened if I accidentally froze the dry yeast pact? What happened with the yeast viability? And also there is a second question about viability, and it's, I saw it somewhere. Someone asked, why do we recommend to not stir the yeast during rehydration?
Okay.
How that affects viability?
Right. So the first question, because of the way we dry yeast, or the degree to which we dry yeast, the dry yeast in the package is anywhere between, the specification is between 94 and 96.5% dry matter. And at that level of dryness, there's no longer any free water left within the cell. Any remaining water molecules are bound within molecules, so that when it is frozen, there's no crystal formation or ice formation. So you can freeze yeast without damaging the cell. And we did validate that through a shelf life study that we did, where we evaluated different storage conditions and saw virtually no difference in performance for freezing yeast stored cold for up to 3 years. And then as far as the question on stirring yeast, so what we did find through the study we did on rehydration and direct pitching is that agitation had the greatest effect on viability of the yeast following the rehydration step. So dry yeast before it's fully rehydrated is the cell wall is potentially more brittle, and the agitation creates a shearing force during the agitation comes into play the first 15 minutes of rehydrating. That shearing force within the liquid can damage the cell wall and cause a decrease in viability. So you can, when you add the dry yeast to the liquid medium, wait a full 15 minutes, and then a gentle stir, and then following that, it can be pitched into the beer. So,
thank you, Brian. So Kevin, I think this question is for you. With your previous life in a huge industrial brewery, someone is asking, is dry yeast more likely to mutate if repitched than liquid yeast? What can you tell us about yeast drift and numbers of generation with dry yeast?
That's really a really complicated question. Not because. So just to start, really once the yeast goes into a liquid solution, it becomes liquid yeast, right? So it starts as dry yeast in the package. We dry it so that it's shelf stable for a long period of time. But once you put the yeast into a liquid, whether you rehydrate or you direct pitch or however you do it, once you put the yeast into a liquid, the yeast will rehydrate and then is a liquid yeast. So is dry yeast more likely to mutate if repitched than liquid yeast? No, the answer is no. Simply because once the dry yeast is in liquid, it will become liquid yeast. There's no difference after that period. in terms of, how you move forward with it. Really, when you talk about the mutation or the drift, genetic drift with yeast, it seems to be more a strain specific or potentially species specific, but strain specific characteristic that some strains will mutate and drift much faster than other strains will. Some strains are known to just stay stable for a very, very long period of time. I think I visited a brewery in Canada once that said they were on their 200th repitch or something of one strain or one group of strains. I think at some point you will have genetic drift, no matter which strain it is, but it seems that there are some strains that are slower in moving away from the typical character that you're expecting from that, where others can be 1, 2, 3 generations, and they're already different in terms of fermentation kinetics, volatile flavors, VDK reduction at the end of fermentation. Any characteristics of yeast, those can change quite dramatically in a short period of time. And it also depends really on the beer you're producing. So what I mean by that is if you're doing really high gravity, or you're adding an enzyme to break all the carbohydrates down to fermentables, and the yeast is in basically an alcohol and water solution at the end, they're going to be more likely to change genetically because they're fighting against those stress factors. So is there a difference between dry and liquid yeast in terms of mutation? My answer is no, but in terms of strain to strain, there can be a huge variety of, quickly changing or very slow to change any characteristics.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, I think the takeout is like, if you want to harvest yeast, try to harvest that from a light beer, light in color, light in ABV, light in IBUs. Like harvesting from extreme beers, like alcohol, IBUs, or other parameters is something you don't do. At a commercial scale, for example, we see a lot that in New England IPAs, you cannot pretty much harvest. There is so much hops add to the beer most of the time in fermentation that then the yeast is really impregnated in hop oils and then dying. I mean, viability is going down super fast. I think we have covered most of the technical questions. Doug has a question about Kvike, but actually it's we don't have a Kvike in a portfolio yet, so we're not talking about that. Sorry, Doug. Research ongoing. Someone is asking more data about the Kvass and the sorghum strain. So Danilo, I think Diego from our colleague Diego from Argentina is listening. Maybe Diego can touch base with Danilo about that. So just so you know, we have some specific strain, and they are for specific market. Like the sorghum strain is for Africa, where they produce a lot of sorghum beer, and Kvass, it's for Europe. But for example, those strains are not available for the US, or for example, sorghum or Kvass strains are not available in the US or in Argentina, I think. There is a good one. I think we can do that. So Peter wanted us to say the three of us at the same time, Saf Ale and Saf Lager. So what are you ready, guys? So let's start with Saf Ale, and at the count of 3, 1, 2, 3.
Saf
Ale and Saf Lager.
Saf Lager. I don't know how did it sounded on the other side of the screen, but I think it was quite good.
So those names come from SAF. The SAF is from the parent company LaSaff. So that's where those 3 letters come from. Then obviously ale and lager come from the strains, or the different species themselves. So SAF is part of LaSaff, and that's where that came from originally.
Yeah.
So I hate to cut this off. You guys keep going.
Can we take one more question, Carrie?
Please, yes, one more question.
One more question. Okay, so sorry, I'm reading the question. So it says, I've heard different answer to this. If I add B134 and B256 at the same time, does one take over until finished and then the next one start, or can I get a blended yeast or a blend? I think, Kevin, that's for you. You love blending stuff personally.
I do.
Go ahead.
I think it's more or less like the next frontier for brewers is to do these sort of things. Obviously, there are brewers that are doing it already, but the short answer to this is if you add them both at the same time, there will be one that will become more dominant, and they will kind of compete with each other in the media. You will get a blend of the flavors. You will get somewhat of a blend of the attenuation, but from my experience in blending yeast, it's not that if you add one that has a higher attenuation that it's always going to be that high attenuation. Usually, if you're adding them at the same time, you'll get somewhere in between the two in terms of the attenuation of the strains, and also just kind of a blend of the flavors of both of them. But it takes a lot of practice and a lot of trials to try to get anything down.
Excellent. That's all the time we have, gentlemen.
Okay.
Awesome.
Incredible info. Thank you, Jose,
Thanks.
Brian, Kevin.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. Thanks for all your questions.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And any of those unanswered questions, come back, because our friends here can come back in, answer those questions. So you can see there. Thank you for our moderator. Thanks, Steffi, for answering some things along the way. And it was great seeing everyone. Please continue with us here. Next up is Grain Fathers Expo and Showcase. And one last monster thank you to Fermentis for being a part and a friend and partner and great, incredible sponsor for AHA and Brewers Association. So thank you.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye.